Images of the January 6th rioters storming the Capitol in Washington, D.C. are ingrained in our minds because that's recent history. But you're probably not aware of a plot more than a century ago, a failed attempt by the Confederates to capture Washington, an attempt that was dangerously close to success. I'm Ann Bocock, and welcome to Between the Covers. Robert Watson is here. He's an award-winning author, historian, and professor. I've lost count of how many incredible books he's written. I know it's somewhere north of 40. The latest is Rebels at the Gates. Robert, again, thank you for making me smarter.
Ann, I love your show, and I love these interviews we do almost every year, so thank you. Appreciate it.
I loved this book for many reasons, but let's start at the beginning. What was your inspiration for this book?
So I love Washington, D.C. In fact, I just returned from one of my many visits to D.C. Who doesn't love the national monuments and memorials, the National Mall, the majestic government buildings, the Smithsonian's? At any rate, exactly 5 miles from the White House and Capitol, there's a small cemetery. It's got to be the smallest national cemetery in the country, maybe an acre. And it's got 40 small white tombstones in 2 little concentric circles. Sitting there guarding this little cemetery are 2 small 6-pound cannons, each one a little bit bigger than this desk, smoothbore. And I've been there several times, and every time I go, I ask people that jog by or walk their dogs. It's in a residential neighborhood. There's fast food, there's a supermarket, housing. I ask everybody, what's this place here? Nobody knows it. What it is, those are the soldiers that are buried there who saved Washington, D.C. in 1864. Just a short ways from that, on what is now Georgia Avenue, is a few yards of earthworks, like basically mounds of soil with some wood around it, and 2 old Civil War cannons and a big rock. That was Fort Stevens. That was ground zero in the defense of Washington, D.C. from a powerful army. And you're right, they came this close to seizing D.C. So I think that this is one of the easily most pivotal, important events in American history that people don't know anything about. And every time I've been to this little, the National Park Service does a great job at this small little plot, this small little cemetery. I've never seen anybody else there. And yet it's the ground zero for the defense of our capital.
Let's go back to 1864. The Civil War has been raging for 3 long years. Abraham Lincoln is the president. The Union is really tired of this war. Lincoln wants it finished his way. Color this picture in for me.
Yes, so you're right. The new scholarship is suggesting over 700,000 Americans died in the Civil War. The textbooks say 620, but new scholarship says that's a low number. So at least 700,000. Millions, amputees, lost an eye, post-traumatic, which we didn't even understand at the time. Lincoln's frustrated. He was also frustrated with his generals. McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, all these generals, they weren't aggressive. And a lot of times the North had Lee, Robert E. Lee, or was winning a battle, yet they wouldn't follow him and finish it off. So he was looking for the right general, and he found him, Grant, Ulysses Grant. And there was a lot of opposition to him picking Grant, and Lee said, Grant fights. I can't spare this man, he fights. In fact, some of his cabinet officers said Grant was an alcoholic. And Lincoln joked and said, well, find out what he's drinking and give it to all my generals, because it's working, right? So Grant designs what's called the Overland Campaign, and Lincoln loves it. Grant's going to mobilize well over 100,000 soldiers. He takes soldiers off of almost every fort, takes artillery, and they're headed straight for Lee. In the meantime, he sends his other generals. One's going to hit Lee here, one's going to hit the Confederacy. So it's in multiple fronts. And the North has more, I always call it the 3 M's. The advantage of more money, more manufacturing, and more men. So with multiple fronts, multiple armies converging, Lee's in trouble. Grant marches down and catches Lee in Petersburg, which is an important crossroads, rail, water, highways, a crossroads transportation hub right next to Richmond, which is the capital. And Grant surrounds them and lays siege on them. Grant is like a pit bull that gets a hold of a bone. He's not letting go. And this scares the you-know-what out of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and Lee, where other generals, when they're taking casualties, they would call it a day. Lee knows that Grant will never stop. Therefore, the war is going to end, not if, but when. Lee then has a desperate final plan to try to salvage this. Meanwhile, Lincoln's all in behind Grant, go and finish this thing. One of Lincoln's concerns is in that fall, he has an election.
There's always an election.
There's always an election. And he's unpopular, and the death toll and war fatigue, Lincoln and his supporters are worried that someone like former General McClellan, George McClellan, they would compromise, allow the South to leave the Union or retain slavery. That's not acceptable to Lincoln. So if we don't end this war soon, if we don't have a big victory, Lincoln could lose the election. So these are the stakes.
The Confederates, meanwhile, are not in good shape. This is 3 years into the war. They are desperate. Mm-hmm. It actually boggles my mind how they even continued. You write so beautifully about this, some despicable things that they had to do to survive.
No question. I've always said, and I say in this book, I don't know how the Confederacy put an army in the field. By the middle of the war, they ran out of food, medicine, clothing. The army that Robert E. Lee, and we'll get to that, sends to sack Washington is a powerful army, but maybe half the soldiers don't have boots. They marched for weeks without shoes. They were all starving. They were foraging for nuts, apples, anything they found. They lacked medicine. Some Confederates who were captured and put into a Union prison, at least they got a blanket, clothing, and food. This is how bad it was. So the Confederacy is in a full-on crisis. Lee knows Grant won't stop. Lee knows it's over. Richmond and Petersburg, Richmond for all intents and purposes surrounded, even though it was Petersburg, because they're connected. It's over for them, and they're starving. They need something to change and end the war quickly. The North needs something to change and end the war quickly.
We're going to talk about some of the major players. Robert E. Lee puts in charge, and these are your words from the book, a balding, foul-mouthed, tobacco-chewing man, Jubal Early.
Yeah.
Now, Early deserves an entire book.
Oh,
this
yes,
is
yeah.
some character.
He's something else.
You got to talk about him.
So Jubal Early reminds me of Yosemite Sam.
Yeah.
He even looked a little like him. He's crusty, he's cantankerous. They said you couldn't understand him because his drawl was so thick. And if you tried to get close to understand him, he spewed tobacco juice on you. He once got into an argument with a preacher who was complaining about how many men were dying and in the cemetery. And what do you have to say about that? And Early said, I'll conscript every damn one of them out of the cemetery. He was just, he was a walking caricature of himself. He was controversial in the genteel South where, Robert E. Lee is well-educated and you have to be married. He was not married. He had a mistress with multiple kids. He was almost thrown out of West Point. He gets in fights with other officers. He's Yosemite Sam. But, number one, Lee lost confidence in most of his generals. Two, most of his generals, like Stonewall Jackson, his best one, they're dead. Number three, Jubal Early was aggressive. He fought. So in some ways, it's the yin and yang of Grant. He fights, he never retreats, he's a pit bull with a bone. So Lee knows he's the right guy because he will go through hell to get the job done.
You're an expert on military history. You've written a lot about it. Do you think, looking back, that he thought he would succeed?
So there's two ways to read Jubal Early and two ways to read Robert E. Lee. Early left a memoir. He left a book about this. Lee never left a memoir, although he left a lot of letters, and they've been compiled. Lee and Early both wrote with an eye to history. Lee was hyper-conscious of his reputation, his image, and Early would be the architect of what is the lost cause myth. that the South was this lovely, idealistic place, and slaves were like our children, and slavery was good, and the North came down and were evil to us. And so as the architect, the designer of this lost cause myth, Early was always saying that everything was good and he could make it happen. I think Lee and Early knew this was a Hail Mary. They knew this was desperate. It probably wouldn't work, but it didn't need to work. For example, if Early made it close to Washington, it would force Grant to take men away from his siege of Petersburg and Richmond and go deal with Early. If Grant took men away, it would allow Lee to escape, or Jefferson Davis to escape, or at least them to try to take a breath. Number two, even if Early wasn't successful, if he almost sacked Washington, or if he almost caught or killed Lincoln, it would embarrass the Union and Lincoln could lose the election. Number three, even if they didn't succeed, the South, as we said earlier, was out of everything. One of the tasks Early was given was to bring back horses, cows, food, to loot and rob. It was basically a marauding mission. Early looted, robbed, harassed everybody. They also were out of money, and Confederate currency was worthless. So they couldn't pay their veterans. They couldn't trade with, Britain and France. So Early looted banks and towns and brought back federal money. So there were so many other objectives besides sacking Washington.
We talked about Grant a minute ago or so. He's appointed by Lincoln. Wasn't this somewhat controversial?
Oh yeah. So Grant is seen as an alcoholic. He's also called a butcher because Grant never retreats. What Grant realizes in a really difficult way is if the North loses 2 men to every 1 man, the South lost. I mean, that's a difficult defeat, but the North is still ahead because they can replenish things. The South can't. If the North has to flee the battlefield and loses 100 cannons, they can manufacture 1,000 more. The South can't. So Grant understands that in some ways it's a war of logistics. And Grant will just go, and put the fear of God into the South. So he was controversial in a lot of ways. Grant didn't graduate the top of his class at West Point. He didn't dress like Napoleon, like some other generals. In fact, there's a wonderful report. A journalist goes to interview Grant in the field, and Grant's sitting at a tent. His uniform is dusty. He's got a flat brim kind of blue cowboy hat on. He looks like an enlisted man. And he's just sitting there, smoking, and it's Grant. And he's humble. So for many reasons, it was a controversial pick, but I am 100% in agreement. It was the right selection by Lincoln.
But here's this tactical error. Like you said, Washington is vulnerable now because the troops are south. They are in Petersburg.
Yep.
So that is a problem.
Oh, big problem. Grant didn't know that Early snuck out of Petersburg and Richmond. A couple days into it, they get a report that there's a massive Confederate army marching toward you. And Grant says, no, they're not. They're in Petersburg. I have them surrounded. They're close to death. There's no way they could manage to march all the way across Virginia, up the Shenandoah, through Maryland, and strike Washington, D.C. Plus, Washington, D.C. at the time had 68 forts, 800 cannons, almost 100 artillery platforms, 30 miles of rifle trenches. So Grant says it's a very powerful city. However, there's no artillerymen, no riflemen, So it was a big mistake by Grant until the very end,
Now, not as major a player, but definitely important to your story is Lew Wallace. He is an impressive, has an impressive military career. He's also criticized. You want to give us a little of...
I like Lew Wallace. Of course, he looks the part. He's got the big walrus mustache like a lot of them did back then. Lew Wallace had a mixed career. He was a smart guy, difficult life. He had some notable military successes, but he was blamed for a failure. And he basically lost his command. So he was demoted to an administrative position in Baltimore. Now, for a heroic general, West Point kind of guy, this is an embarrassment. Lew Wallace is in Baltimore, and he gets word not from Grant, not from the War Department, not from Lincoln. He gets word from a man that owns a railway station. He says, our railway station at Monocacy, it's a town near Baltimore. He's, again, a transportation hub, a crossroads for rail, water, roads, that there's this massive Confederate army converging there, and the next stop is Washington, D.C. Without direct orders, Lew Wallace gobbles together just a few, he's got 2, 3, 4,000 troops, maybe. He rushes there. He could have been court-martialed. And he ends up losing at Monocacy because he's outnumbered, he's outgunned, everything. But they fight like demons. They fight all day. The South has had major casualties. They're exhausted. Most importantly, it's July 9th, 2 days before they sack Washington. The South lost an entire day. They were too exhausted to fight the next day. So, and Lew Wallace ends up, despite being criticized for losing the battle, later Grant says Lew Wallace is the one that saved Washington, D.C. And because he saved Washington, he saved the war. Because he saved the war, he saved the United States. And he goes on to write a book called Ben-Hur.
Who would have thought?
One of the best-selling books of the 19th century. Yeah, I still remember the Charlton Heston film.
I remember that
it's
too.
It's a classic book. So, yeah, Lew Wallace is a Renaissance man.
And the book actually was better seller than Harriet Beecher Stowe's
Uncle Tom's Cabin. Yeah, it would pass hers. Hers was probably second best-selling. Yeah.
I look at him after reading your book as someone who would rather ask forgiveness than permission.
Right. Which, by the way, that's my motto. So if my dean and my campus president are watching,
okay.
now you know my shtick. But no, thank goodness he rushed there. But you know, when you think about it, the Union had telegraphs, the South didn't, but the South was cutting the Union telegraphs. Therefore, you're waiting for a guy to ride up with a leather bag and a satchel saying, look out. He had to act. And he knew, he probably thought he and everybody would die doing it. But they're going to delay the South, give the Union time to reinforce Washington. And they did. They inflicted major casualties, and the fighting was atrocious at Monocacy.
This day was a close call for President Lincoln.
Yeah.
And this is a guy who is not a fan of being told what to do, where to go. Mm-hmm. Tell this story.
So they wanted Lincoln, Stanton was the war secretary, a gruff, tough, difficult guy, but competent. He wanted Lincoln to leave Washington. The assistant Navy secretary, everybody wanted Lincoln to leave. It wasn't safe. They had a fast steamer waiting on the Potomac. They had his carriage ready. They had an escort, a military escort. Lincoln wouldn't leave. In fact, not only did he not want to leave, he was touring the forts. He was at the battle. Lincoln, ultimately, as Union soldiers arrive at the wharf, Lincoln actually goes down and welcomes them to the wharf. He's hugging, shaking hands, welcome, follow me. He leads them into the fort. So on July 12th, 1864, Lincoln goes to Fort Stevens. It was named for General Isaac Stevens, a great Union general who was killed while leading from the front. It used to be called Fort Massachusetts because it was built by soldiers from Massachusetts. So he goes to Fort Stevens, which is on the northwestern part of Washington, D.C. The intelligence, which was spotty, was that the South were going from Maryland, so the South would be coming from the north, actually. And Fort Stevens would be ground zero. So Lincoln goes there, but he's not content to just be there. He climbs up on the parapet, on the walls, and he's asking the officers, show me where they're going to come from. But what they didn't realize, the South had sharpshooters hidden in a barn, in an apple tree, and so forth and so on. And Lincoln, of course, is the most iconic person in world history.
Is he wearing the hat?
He has the hat.
Okay.
He's 6'4" in a day and age when men were a foot smaller. And he's standing up there. A shot rings out. It hits right near where Lincoln and this officer are standing, ricochets and hits the officer in the leg, knocks him off. Someone reaches up and grabs Lincoln, pulls him off and yells, "Get down, you damn fool." So Lincoln is almost killed. Now, this is in the thick of the fighting. If we lose Lincoln in July of 1864, it's a different outcome in American history. And he comes this far away from getting shot. Lincoln later apologizes to everybody. You're all doing your job. I put you in danger. I'm sorry. But and then Mary Todd was having a fit, his wife. Everybody wanted him to leave. He ultimately does leave, but not before shaking everybody's hand.
Of course.
Typical. So, yeah.
You know, today people throw around cavalier terms like the country's headed for a civil war. But I think we need to take a step back. It cannot be overstated enough what actually happened as far as loss. It is unequaled into anything else in our history.
Yeah. Civil War is our bloodiest war. More people died than in World War II, than in World War I. The number of Americans that died in prison camps is larger than the total number that died in Vietnam or Korea. Just the number that died in prison camps in the South is larger than the total battlefield count of the Revolution, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, and Spanish-American War, cumulative put together. So the Civil War is without precedent. And, this nation comes very close to ceasing to exist. And with Lincoln almost being shot, and if the Confederates can sack Washington, D.C., it's hard to play what if, and historians are told not to do that, but I think it's irresistible. I'm of the belief that this would have been it. That would have been the end. Think about it. Washington, D.C. was not just our capital. It was the command and control and communications center of the nation. All the military left from Washington, D.C. The telegraphs were there. The storehouses of cannons and food and everything was there. So if the South gets Washington, it's over. Now, even if the Confederates don't have enough men to hold Washington, what if they burn all the storehouses? What if they take all the weapons back? What if they killed, the entire War Department? What if they kill or capture Lincoln or ransom? There's so many scenarios where this thing goes sideways.
It is chilling just to take a beat and think about that. You also remind us in the book what Shelby Foote wrote, that it is impossible to understand the United States history without understanding the Civil War.
Shelby Foote, the great writer, said it was the definitive event in American history. No question about it. Fortunately, the Confederate Army marches to the cusp of Washington. Early, and this is how I opened the book, Early rides up on horseback with his officers, and he's sitting there and he's looking through his field glasses at the newly finished Capitol Dome. It was just put in place. And he sees Washington and he's smiling. And he's not smiling because of what he sees, he's grinning because of what he doesn't see. Soldiers. Washington's available for the taking. And he had the city at that moment. This is July 10, July 11. He had the city. However, the entire Confederate Army was a couple miles behind him, lying down under trees or asleep because they had 2 days of constant boozing. So in a way, alcohol saved the United States. I found these cute letters between an Army general and a Navy admiral. And the Army general saying, "We, the Army, saved the nation." What it was, the Confederates hit a warehouse full of booze, and it was a Navy warehouse. And it got him. So the naval admiral says, no, it was the Navy's alcohol that won. The Confederates, and of course, everybody that's been to Washington, D.C. in July knows it's the most humid, hot place on the planet, with wool uniforms, and they're running out of water. They drink to excess, and then drink to excess, and then drink to excess. The entire army is in no condition to fight. Thank goodness. Because Early's sitting there saying that the capital's ours. Then he says, my army can't fight. I'll give them a day to sober up, and we'll hit them tomorrow morning at dawn. Well.
So thank goodness for the alcohol.
Thank goodness for the alcohol. Fortunately, eyes see the Confederate Army. People in Washington see the campfires burning. They hear them running around shooting their guns, marauding, pillaging, drinking, and partying. So they send a fast steamship and a telegraph down to Grant.
What's the part as an author that gets your adrenaline going?
Oh, it's two things. It's uncovering the story and the research.
You love the research.
I do. I'm a kid in a candy store. In fact, I was taking selfies in the National Archives this week, and I wrote to a friend and said somebody would be at a bar or somebody would be, but I was in the National Archives, like, woohoo. But so my sweet spot, and Ann, you've been wonderful over the years about allowing me to come and share my passion, but my sweet spot is to try to find the story that people forgot or missed. What's the story behind the story? I don't want to mine, territory that's been done over and over and over again. So it takes an extraordinary amount of time and a lot of reading, but I like it, fortunately, and I'm a professor, so I get a lot of time off. But so I love to try to find that story that we've missed. And there's not only more we don't know about history than we do know, but there's some whoppers out there still waiting. Then when you actually go and do the research, I feel like a detective. only everybody in my crime scene's been dead since 1865 or so. So it makes it really challenging. It must be a rush to be a paleontologist, put a shovel in the ground and find a new dinosaur bone, or an archaeologist that finds the tip of a pyramid or something. So in some ways, that's the metaphor I like to use to uncover these tidbits. And then once you find out about Jubal Early, then you want to learn, and I won't put a word down and write until I find out where I can tell you where they were every single day during the month they marched to Washington, what they ate, what the weather was like, how many men fell over, because they all wrote it down.
We know you as an author, a professor, historian, media commentator. What about rock musician?
So I'm blessed in that I have a patient girlfriend, patient kids, patient friends, and I work as a professor. So I always joke and say I don't have a real job. But I put in 15 and 18-hour days, 365. So to de-stress, I love to swim laps, I love to play a little basketball, and I love to play music. So I play in a couple of bands, from rock to Motown to blues to reggae and there's nothing like music, to just unwind. And so for me, it saves me from hiring a shrink, So a few laps in the pool, a good game of basketball, or playing some live music is good for what ails you. So,
Robert, I could do this every week.
Oh, I could too.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
The book is Rebels at the Gates.
I'm Ann Bocock. Please join us for the next Between the Covers and listen to our podcast, Go Between the Covers.